Good morning. Thank you for joining us at the Drivers for Sound Corporate Climate Governance Insights on Board Governance and Stakeholder Communication webinar organized by the Business Environment Council, or BEC. My name is Violet from BEC's Policy and Research team and your host today. This webinar is supported by BEC's Climate Change Business Forum Advisory Group, representing one of our core environmental focus areas on climate change. BEC has recently published a report titled Corporate Governance for Climate Resilience, Emerging Challenges and Opportunities for Companies in Hong Kong, which discusses trends of corporate climate governance and understanding industry practices. This webinar is part of the project in which we will focus on how companies respond to stakeholder activism and communicate the issue of climate change internally and externally. Now, for a few housekeeping rules, today's webinar will be recorded, so please feel free to revisit the content when the webinar is later uploaded to BEC's website and our YouTube channel. Participants are all muted by default. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers, please use the Q&A or chat functions at the bottom of your screen, and we will address them during the panel discussion. We are really delighted to have 4 expert speakers joining us this morning to discuss probably one of the hottest topics in the past year on ESG, disclosure and engagement, and the ecosystem overall. To kickstart, please welcome Mr. Jamie Allen, Secretary General of the Asian Corporate Governance Association, or the ACGA, to share with us the Asian trend on corporate governance and ESG, as well as insights from the recently published RCG Watch 2020 report. Jamie, please.
Great, thank you, Violet, and thank you to BEC for inviting me here today. I just want to give a very high-level presentation this morning. Sorry. I'm just going to give a high-level presentation this morning on the results of our RCG Watch Survey 2020, and part of that looks at ESG reporting and climate governance around Asia. The report was published earlier this year and is called Future Promise, Aligning Governance and ESG in Asia. Why do we say governance and ESG need to be aligned? Well, there's 3 key reasons really for this. One is that we believe corporate governance, ESG, and investor stewardship are closely interrelated. I think most people would agree with that. Yet what we find around the region is that they're very much siloed from a policy-making perspective in many markets. Some markets are bringing these closer together, but many markets, they're still quite siloed. So for example, most corporate governance codes in the region, which have been around for the best part of 15 to 20 years, they don't talk very much about ESG and sustainability issues, and they have very little to say on board governance around the E and the S. So there's very little reference, for example, to climate change and the need for boards to prepare for climate change in most corporate governance codes today. Likewise, investor stewardship codes say little about the internal fund governance of funds, and there's very little link between investor stewardship codes and CG codes and ESG reporting guidelines. Investor stewardship codes put a lot of focus on institutional investors to really take ESG seriously. So the lack of a link between these policy documents, we think, is an impediment to companies understanding the interconnectedness between them. These are the rankings from our RCG Watch Survey 2020. You can see Australia at the top, Hong Kong, Singapore coming equal second, and then other markets flowing accordingly. The survey covers the ecosystem of corporate governance in the region, but just on ESG, some of the positives we see is that there's been a definite expansion in ESG reporting in the region and greater regulatory guidance around ESG reporting. Sustainability committees are being formed at the board and in many companies in senior management, and in some companies you get middle-level management working teams on sustainability, but that tends to be in a relatively small number of blue chips around the region. And fund managers, in part due to the stewardship codes, are integrating ESG more into their investment processes and their voting and engagement with companies. So there's a very strong focus on ESG and a very strong drive among the leading companies and the larger investors in this area. Some of the negatives are that more ESG reporting, more data doesn't necessarily lead to more clarity. Particularly investors find it difficult to understand some of the very detailed GRI style reports that come out. You know, there's a lot of data in there It's not necessarily just written for investors, of course. So what do you do actually with the data? And some of the data can be a bit confusing as to what the company is saying, and particularly the narratives around what the data means and what do these major ESG risks mean for a company's business. Often that narrative is quite weak in company sustainability reports. Another area that's weak is the explanations of materiality and how those were derived, how the targets, how the materiality issues were derived. And whilst there's lots of metrics in reports, quite often the targets are not there, or if they are there, they're somewhat simplistic. And another concern for us as a corporate governance association is that ESG is often treated as a substitute for corporate governance, rather than the G in ESG we see as the governance of the environmental and social factors. CG, corporate governance itself, is a broader set of issues. And these are those broader set of issues. These are the 7 categories we cover in our CG Watch rankings of the different markets. And I've just listed the 7 different categories here. We call most of these stakeholder categories because these are the key stakeholders in the corporate governance universe in the region. And one category, CG rules, is more thematic than stakeholder focused. But I've just listed the categories in red that do touch upon ESG to some degree. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And just highlighted here the markets that have scored the highest and the lowest in the different categories. And not surprisingly, the markets that score higher in our survey also have a stronger focus on ESG, both at the policy level and also at the corporate level. So just highlighting some of the policy and practice issues around the region in the categories that where we cover ESG in our survey. Some of the issues in government and public governance, you see developed markets in the region moving ahead now quite strongly on sustainable and green finance issues and support for SASB and TCFD. But what's quite interesting is regulators within markets are not always joined up. So you may have the Securities Commission promoting TCFD, but the stock exchange not necessarily quite so enthusiastic, or vice versa. We also look at bank governance, and the guidelines there are extremely variable, and the link to green finance is the policies are very variable around the region. In terms of CG rules, ESG reporting standards are also extremely variable. And one of the issues for global investors is that often the local ESG reporting rules are not necessarily closely linked to international reporting standards, such as GRI, SASB, or TCFD. This is changing in some markets, but it's moving ahead at very different paces. Among listed companies, some of the issues are clearly, whilst the blue chips we're seeing, and I think today you'll hear more about this, the blue chips are embracing ESG and climate governance. However, many other companies are struggling with producing sensible ESG reports. Often they have to revert to consultants, and that tends to lead to a sort of a sameness and a homogeneity in the type of reports you're getting from many listed companies. And I think it's fair to say that whilst the larger companies have accepted that ESG does bring value to a company, I think many listed companies remain unconvinced. And the assurance of ESG reports is extremely limited. That's a rather large area that we feel assurance is important, but the way it's done is also extremely important. So there needs to be more capacity to do this assurance of ESG reports. Among investors, you've had a massive build-up of ESG teams, new financial products, new ESG funds. Again, some investors are very committed to this. For others, it's greenwashing. It's a marketing exercise. So sort of differentiating between who's really taking this seriously, who's really investing properly in building that ESG capacity is important. And voting has always been, a thing that investors do around the region. They're using their votes more effectively, but engaging with companies is becoming sort of the major issue. And so really building capacity for engagement is important. And the last area in our survey where we touch upon ESG is civil society and media. This is a really important part of the CG ecosystem. You see a lot of professional bodies, institutes gearing up with research and training. But in some markets, clearly civil society is highly constrained. as is the media. And that's, I think, going to affect the development of ESG in those markets. And just my last slide on Hong Kong, looking at how Hong Kong compares in the different categories. And I've put under the category the percentage score Hong Kong got and the ranking. So you can see quite variable rankings. Although Hong Kong came equal second in our survey overall, some of it didn't do so well in some of the other categories of our survey. In government, public governance, we're interested that the Monetary Authority and the SFC have been quite strong on TCFD. We think Hong Kong Exchange much less so. If you look at the revised ESG reporting guide, it doesn't actually mention TCFD. Some supporting documents do, but the actual guide itself doesn't mention it by name, other international standards. CG rules, if you look at the CG code, it's now undergoing some revision, but it still doesn't really address ESG and sustainability in a very explicit way and has very little to say on climate governance. We hope that's something that will change in future. Listed companies, it's a similar story as I mentioned regionally. It's the big blue chips. Some of the leading blue chips are moving ahead with sustainability and climate governance, as per the very interesting BEC report recently on climate governance. But overall, I think it's fair to say that ESG reporting at the market level is lagging the rest of the region. Among investors, you see the Monetary Authority explicitly supporting responsible investment and stewardship. A few asset managers, domestic asset managers, have followed suit. But overall, there's not a lot of evidence that domestic asset managers are really explicitly looking at ESG and using it in their investment and in their voting and engagement with companies. If they are, they're not talking about it. And we know that some funds are doing some good work in this area, but aren't talking about it. So we would encourage them to be more explicit. And then just finally, civil society media. I think this is an area where Hong Kong actually is, although the ranking is only 6th, we do see quite a lot of professional bodies and associations here focusing more on ESG training and advocacy. There's a strong rise of green finance. And some of the business chambers are becoming more enlightened in their views on governance and ESG, which is great. Some media reporting on ESG, but as a former journalist, we'd like to see a lot more of it. And with that, Violet, I'll turn back. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for setting the scene and explaining in a broader context the big picture of ESG development in Asia and also in Hong Kong. Well, and I guess with the recent public consultation on the revision of the CG code, we expect to see more linkages between ESG and corporate governance. So up next, let's shift our focus to stakeholder communication and engagement. We have Dr. Margaret Bernard, Program Director, Masters of Social Sciences in Sustainability, Leadership and Governance, and lecturer of the Center for Civil Society and Governance at the University of Hong Kong, who will share with us her insight on stakeholder activism, the challenges and the opportunities. Maggie, please.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your kind introduction and thank you for the invite to share today on this very timely topic. I've been tasked with taking a look at this concept, I suppose, of changing perceptions of ESG, how it needs to change, and some points with regard to communication. Oh dear, it's not, oh, there we go. I'd like to start also, first of all, with the use of the word activism. I was tasked with sort of covering a little bit of this, shareholder activism. I'm going to use the word activism, but I'd like to actually propose that we reframe and actually move away from the traditional activism as being quite confrontational, to it really meaning actively engaging with stakeholders, and that stakeholder engagement is in fact a critical aspect of good governance. All stakeholders are now actively trying to engage corporates on the current ESG agenda, from climate change to all the social equity issues that we've seen really bubble up to the conversations right now. A key stakeholder, of course, are the shareholders, who can exercise their abilities and the tools to get the attention of the board. Research shows us that as the conversations, and you can see from some of the headlines that we've put here, we're seeing more and more of this, as these conversations become more active and we see them arise increasingly on a wider and a more varied set of platforms, we do tend to see a transition from voluntary adoption and competitive advantage to being integrated into various codes, guidance, policy, and then eventually we see forms of regulation. Boards can't ignore this. If they do, they'll more likely experience increasing activism as investors increasingly push for this adoption of ESG in order to ensure or protect value, as well as legitimacy and credibility of the firm. The risk of not acting is and will be significant. And as we said here, the research has also shown us that really when investors or shareholders step up in forms of activism, it's shown it actually to be a form of suggesting or shaping even strategy to the benefit of the organization. But however, let's keep in mind this might be at the exclusion of other stakeholders who bring opportunities. And this is part of the dialogue with regard to climate change being more strategic. So in the same way shareholders or investors are pushing for improvements, other stakeholders too have an interest in seeing not only improved ESG performance, but particularly are looking for a more strategic approach to climate change. So for an institutional investor really to turn its back on an ESG themed activism campaign means running the risk of being criticized for disregarding the financial and ethical priorities of its clients. The second half of this quote speaks to the need to understand activism is not just by shareholders. Boards and management will need to ensure they are identifying opportunities for engaging with other expert stakeholders as well. This may also counteract the less well-meaning activism whereby ESG is a PR exercise or coming from equally misunderstood motives. It's not clear whether ESG activists all incorporate this ESG as a core pillar, or if such themes are used actually to support other agendas, such as replacing directors. So there are challenges, but we have to face them. As long as other stakeholders view the firm's actions as, shall we say, less well-meaning or superficial in their adoption of ESG, then firms may lose the talent that they actually will need to operationalize their climate change strategy. So let's not forget that these issues are interdependent. Boards can preempt shareholder investor activism, or any stakeholder activism for that matter, by proactively adopting ESG and understanding its implications to the business as a strategy in itself. So in response actually to the point in BEC's report where some firms focus on climate change more broadly versus those focusing on energy efficiency and emissions, means we need to look at how climate change and ESG in general is being viewed and whether being strategic actually is well understood. So let me segue to communication. We need to see ESG in much more of a joined up and integrated manner, because currently the E and the S are presented without the economy. And the governance is being looked at in terms of the E and the S almost separately. What we need to do is actually move away from this and start reframing the language so that we can actually say it's the G of C, or governance of SEE, society, environment, and economy. Because otherwise right now, even the way we're currently framing it, we could actually be exacerbating this siloed thinking and the E and the S as add-ons. So in terms of communication, I want to just, my very, very simple diagram is here is the current thinking that we have to address economy, and then the others come along nicely, society and environment. We've done, many organizations are trying to translate environment, society, and the economy into this three pillars, or in a balanced perspective of the three bottom lines. What I'd like to actually propose here is the reality is that organizational governance is about accountability, responsibility, and ownership for their positive and negative impacts on environment, society, and economy in a much more integrated manner. So we actually need to reset how we see ESG and reframe this for more strategic approaches. So I'm going to show this diagram for a little while. This is something that we use in the classroom. And I want to talk about the communication. So we explore what companies look like, how they behave, and the language that they use with regard to how strategic they are with regard to ESG issues, and of course, climate change strategy for the sake of today. So this is how we can view companies' progress from a very reactive stance to proactive. This is reflected in their communications. The language they use actually shows us where their mindset lies, where they are in their progress. My students find this absolutely fascinating as we study the research, and the research shows us things like inclusive versus exclusive language, motherhood statements, that sameness that Jamie referred to in reporting, but also the well-meaning language of risk. So this keeps the mindset in risk management, in mitigation, and a more reactive stance as well-meaning as the tools of enterprise risk management, i.e. risk management processes and heat maps, don't help necessarily with identifying opportunities. And this is absolutely critical for addressing climate change more strategically. So since, excuse me, adaptation and resilience provide considerable benefits when we see them as the three together. So unfortunately, ESG as a piece of communication alone, we're currently actually adopting it and doing less bad. First arrow indicates where the focus tends to be, and this is indicator focused. Its efficiency is necessary, however, it does not equate with sustainability. Still doing more with less, and so keeps firms in this efficiency mode, reactive to drivers, i.e. activism. This second arrow, moving beyond risk-based and efficiency mentality to opportunity seeking, to being more proactive, looking more for this integrated thinking and being more strategic, means that we could look at climate change strategically, and that is mitigation, adaptation, and resilience as a triple benefit. So my last, I'll end on this quote, and that's where we need to actually encourage the whole of the board to be aware enough that they need to engage actively with the climate change experts, the stakeholders that bring this conversation to them, and the directors that bring this fluency to a much more of a strategic development at the top. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, for your sharing on stakeholder activism and the topic. No doubt the changing perception of ESG and sustainability over time have created a lot of new opportunities for companies to transition their businesses to a more responsible one. And we're really looking forward to see more proactive approaches to address these ongoing challenges. And that, of course, includes climate change. May I now invite our next speaker, Mr. John Hafner, General Manager, Sustainability of Hang Lung Properties Limited, to share the Hang Lung experience on corporate climate governance. John, please.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to join this discussion. So I'd like to share our perspective, recognizing that each company is going to have its own unique approach, but perhaps there's some insights or ideas that others can take from the journey that we're undergoing. First of all, with regard to, before we get to climate governance specifically, I'll just talk about ESG governance at Hang Lung overall. We have as the Hong Kong Exchange is requiring a board statement on ESG, and we went through that exercise, and it was useful because it got us to think about the specific dimensions of our board engagement. We have a highly engaged board. I personally, as the sustainability lead executive, report to the board as a whole twice a year at a minimum. And then below the, I'll talk a bit more about some of our other forms of engagement, but we have an executive level sustainability steering committee that is also overseen by our vice chair, an executive board member, and that meets twice a year. And we set annual ESG KPIs through that committee and then report up to the board. And then the team that I lead work quite engaged on the more detailed work of strategy development and execution. So that's the sort of middle set of boxes, if you like. And then on the left-hand side, you can see the risk side of our governance, where we have an enterprise risk management working group, and then a board that's reporting to the board's audit committees. And the ERM working group, we went through an exercise of looking at our enterprise risk management risks that are held at the enterprise level, and which of those are also ESG related risks. And we looked at integration of ERM and ESG. Then on the right-hand side, you can see that we've got a sustainability steering committee that's responsible for overseeing, for instance, the allocation of proceeds from green bonds and green finance. So that's the broad framework for our ESG governance. What is not evident here is that there's a reality too of just how engaged specific executive board members are. If I give this week as an example, I have 4 meetings this week with our vice chair on various sustainability related matters, 2 of which are also including our CEO. And so there really is a very high level of engagement that doesn't get captured by this kind of chart. We also have had meetings with non-executive board members with our sustainability team, which is quite unusual to have senior board members wanting to be that interested to meet directly with our team as a whole. So that's the general context. We set a sustainability framework where we defined an overarching goal to become one of the most sustainable real estate companies in the world. We want to be one of the most sustainable companies because it's the right thing to do, but also because we see opportunity in it. And once we define that overarching goal, we further articulated 4 specific goals that set an agenda for us over the next decade. And you could think of these 4 goals as things that we want to become very good at, that we think are critical and material for our business, which is not to say that there aren't other things we also need to do as a company. So when we talk about having a company with strong governance, there are other issues that everybody has to worry about, cybersecurity, let's say, but that might not be one of the most material issues for us in the real estate sector in relation to these other issues. And then we announced last December 10 specific targets underlying these 4 goals. So that's the broad framework. And this has been quite helpful because it provides a lot of clarity. We heard Jamie speaking earlier about, with all of the data and reporting, materiality isn't always obvious to investors. This framework has been quite helpful because it allows us as a company to understand what is our agenda, what are our major priorities that we need to work on. So carbon footprint, if you move around sort of falling from left to right, circularity, well-being, and then the 4th goal is about how all our transactions should be advancing our ESG priorities. So our sources and uses of capital and how we engage our suppliers upstream and our customers, that is in our case, our tenants downstream. So, and then you can see that when it comes to climate resilience, just how significant an issue this is for us. The first goal already is about reducing our carbon footprint in line with science. But then on our 4th goal, when we think about our entire value chain, there are a number of dimensions we want to engage our suppliers and our customers around. And these are just examples. But there's no question that to do climate resilience properly, we need to engage our suppliers on embodied carbon on the one hand, and we need to engage our tenants on emissions reduction on the other. So we will be engaging our suppliers and tenants on other issues, but for sure, this is a fundamental one that we see as a top priority to begin with. And so then with respect to the risk side, and we'll talk a little bit later to Margaret's point about the opportunity side and the strategic view we take on climate governance. But on the risk side, the left-hand side, again, as mentioned earlier, our Enterprise Risk Management Working Group oversees all of our enterprise level risks. And as the lead executive on sustainability, I'm the owner of the risk of climate change risk for the company, which we think of in terms of transition and physical risk following the TCFD distinction. And of course, we identify energy efficiency and adaptability as material to our business. So to elaborate a bit more on the risk side, on transition risk, we're thinking of this in a number of dimensions. And you can think of transition risk in simple terms, or at least I think of it in simple terms as, if you don't get moving on climate, how are you exposed where investors and regulators and others are expecting action? And so we have an ambitious target to reduce our emissions intensity by, in our interim results, announcement at the end of July, we publicly committed to a significant increase in carbon reduction investments between July 2021 to December 2022. We're developing plans for procurement of on-site and off-site renewable energy, and we're examining our potential exposure to a carbon price. With regard to the physical risk side, we partnered with a climate modeling expert to complete risk assessments across our portfolio. We're developing an adaptation plan. We've also plan to allocate funds for climate adaptation spending, and we're deepening our assessment around asset level risk assessment and risk ownership, and looking at optimizing emergency response procedures. So we're thinking about transition risk is around, can we get on with emissions reduction, and physical risk around, the climate is already changing. Are we well equipped with respect to the exposures our assets have in relation to those changes that are underway? And then I want to pick up on the point that Margaret made earlier with respect to the opportunity side. This is, I think, something quite important to highlight, because sometimes there's a view that climate change is purely a risk issue. Really, that comment that Margaret made resonates with me, because the flip side of risk is opportunity, and we see a lot of opportunity in embracing this agenda. First of all, the central government, the Hong Kong governments have made net zero commitments, and they're going to need help from all stakeholders. So we want to be an early mover to signal our support of those agendas. Second, a lot of the investments we will undertake do result in a return on investment, and in some cases also enhance thermal comfort for our customers and our tenants. With regard to the physical risk side, I think it's important that companies don't just consider the boundaries of their own assets, but the interconnectedness of their assets with surrounding infrastructure. There's a lot of interdependency. The C40 Cities Initiative has some good work on this. And so we see opportunity to collaborate with others to strengthen resilience together in municipal infrastructure, to look at the drainage system, to look at electricity infrastructure and otherwise. With our tenants, many of our tenants have significant sustainability commitments of their own. So we want to partner with strategic tenants on green leases to advance shared commitments. There's a Venn diagram that we can do with a lot of our tenants, and there's a lot of overlap in what we're committed to and what they are committed to, particularly our luxury brand tenants that are very important for our business model in particular. And there can be reductions in costs of capital through sustainable finance. As of now, you'll probably know that those reductions are quite marginal, but over time they may become larger, and that can go to your cost of capital of your business. We do see an opportunity in attracting and retaining talented employees who identify with our sustainability agenda. We think it's something that can excite people and engage people and retain people around. And then we had a refresh of our corporate values recently, where we kind of refined our articulation of our corporate values for the next 60 years just following our 60th anniversary as a company. And we see this really getting on with this seriously as giving meaningful expression to our corporate values. We have a mission of sustainable growth, and we see that mission as having a double aspect. It has the financial aspect of sustainable growth, but also the ESG aspect. And the integration of those two things together, to Margaret's point, is for us as a business. And then lastly, we see opportunities around brand building and external recognition through strong climate disclosure, and being able to show our stakeholders that we are indeed taking the issue seriously and we're deeply engaged with it. So just my last slide is just on disclosure and engagement. I also wanted to just follow Jamie's comment that lots and lots of data doesn't necessarily bring more insight, and there's so many different standards out there. So we're certainly trying to frame our reporting in ways that we think will be understandable for others, and still mindful of some of the global best practices and expectations with respect to reporting and indices and benchmarks. But we try to look at all of this as proxies and opportunities for driving real improvements in performance. The disclosure and the data requirements can actually challenge us to make sure that we've got the right systems and controls in place to move forward. The last comment I'll just make here is that in discussions with investors, we have historically received inquiries from investors in the form of sort of standardized forms, and we fill those in and respond. But when we actually have the opportunity to speak to investors one-on-one, it's a very different kind of opportunity and conversation. And I think we're able to convey our commitment in those conversations in a different way. So it's quite helpful to be able to actually speak to investors and have a real dialogue with them around what we're doing, and to understand what they care about and what they're thinking about. And we would actually see that the pressure, if you want to think of it that way, or the activism, as Margaret spoke about, from investors, is a positive thing, because what it allows us to do is to show there's alignment between the investor community in the direction of more action and leadership, and what we have already committed to internally. So we actually see that as a very positive form of engagement. And in some ways, it's moving even faster than the government regulatory kind of pressure that people talk about. So I hope that's helpful, but this is a kind of snapshot of how we're engaging in climate governance at Hanwha. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for a comprehensive presentation on sustainability governance at Hang Lung. And it's really nice to see that there's a strong interest and engagement with the board members and the senior management, and that Hang Lung is actually embracing the opportunities through a life cycle approach using embodied carbon, but also to engage and the value chain partners along. So now let us move on to the panel discussion, which will focus on the practical challenges and opportunities of climate governance and stakeholder engagement. Again, if you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to type your questions using the Q&A or chat function. May I now introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Jeannie Ng, Chair of the Hong Kong Institute of Qualified Environmental Professionals. I'll now pass the time to you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Violet. And thank you all for joining us today. So I think I'm going to, as much as everyone knows, I have tons of questions, but I will actually try to pick a few from obviously our online audience who are here today. The first one, quite interesting. Will it be possible to share, I guess, the events or actions that give an impression that the Hong Kong Stock Exchange is not keen on TCFD? And I think that comment comes from Jamie's first presentation, which did mention a bit about sort of there's misalignment. So it could be one department is advocating, the other isn't. And sometimes you'll see mention of it, but it's not in the actual regulatory text, but in the annex. So maybe you might want to elaborate a bit more on that.
Sure. Well, just to get one foot out of hot water here, I might preface my comments by saying that there are many aspects of the 2019 revision of the ESG reporting guide in Hong Kong that we did think were positive. For example, the stronger focus on board oversight, on materiality, the introduction of a climate change KPI, and also the introduction of the social KPIs. So the submission did make many positive comments, but we were disappointed on TCFD and more broadly on the international standards part, because we did feel the revision was an opportunity for the exchange to really say to companies in Hong Kong, you know, there are other international standards out there, particularly SASB and TCFD. And here's why you should be thinking about using them. And we felt that, you know, incorporating that language into the actual guide itself would have been useful. Particularly coming after the fact that the SFC and the Monetary Authority prior to that had actually emphasized TCFD as being important for Hong Kong. And we just felt that, you know, not including that in the actual guide was a missed opportunity. And I think it's because the exchange, you know, they're regulating listed companies. They've got a very wide universe of companies to regulate. It's not just the larger blue chips that are doing good work. There's many second, third line stocks that are clearly you know, resistant to doing this sort of reporting, that are worried about, you know, things like the complications of TCFD. So clearly the exchange, I think, you know, meets a lot of resistance every time it tries to do reform. But we just felt that was a missed opportunity, and it just signaled, I think, that the exchange, you know, is not as committed to that particular standard as the SFC and the Monetary Authority.
So, I mean, pardon me, obviously I'm not a governance expert, but then when I was looking at the most updated version, you know, I did see the change in terms of a new extra session on the climate change that had been inserted, right, which was very relevant to what TCFD is trying to raise awareness on, at least on the resilience bit, or sort of the other way around, which is, you know, what is the impact of, you know, the climate on business, which is pretty much the spirit of TCFD. So I thought that was a good start, because that is in the body of the requirements, or the environmental part of the disclosures. Do you not feel that that's a good start?
Well, it was a start, but I think it would have been better for companies if there'd been more explicit reference to TCFD in the actual guide itself, and how to address, because I think a lot of companies look at something like TCFD and they're rather afraid of this acronym that is, you know, a little bit technical and, you know, sounds a bit scary. And when you actually look at TCFD, you know, I think it's a less threatening and you know, more friendly set of standards. And, you know, there is reference to TCFD in the supporting educational documents, but you do have to sort of search for it to find it.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions for John, but maybe we'll just start first of all with, and I'm very interested in this part, which was in your goal number 1 for your focus on embodied carbon. can you share any of the more specific efforts and challenges in this area when you're trying to align with your fellow property developers on sort of harmonizing, what's the methodology really in calculating, for example, embodied carbon? Obviously that needs to be an industry-wide type of agreed methodology, as opposed to everyone deciding to do their own. How does Hanglung see that developing, or is it developing? Maybe not. Maybe it'll take time.
Yes, thank you. So that absolutely, we see the need for that. It would not make sense for each company to develop its own methodology for calculating embodied carbon and looking at how to achieve this. This is not an area of competitive advantage where you want to hold information to yourself and not share with others. So we very much welcome and see the need for more collaboration with colleagues around us. In fact, we had a discussion with BEC earlier this summer about how can we do more around this issue together, and there's some discussions underway about going deeper in that issue and setting up some best practices with some international organizations that are working on this. So absolutely, we see the need for that. And with respect to challenges, one of the challenges that we face, and it may be different in other businesses, but for us in real estate, is about how do you engage the suppliers exactly? So if we have a traditional business model where you have a main contractor, the main contractor may then engage suppliers to source materials for our projects. It's not traditionally the case that the real estate company will add all kinds of specifications down the line, and so and there's a challenge of how do you rethink the entire supplier engagement process in a way that allows you to achieve the objective. The other issue is, just in terms of pricing. I mean, we're not there yet, but I personally would like to see a situation where we actually can bring the carbon pricing into the sourcing, because that would make it much easier. Right now, somebody asked me the question, how much more are you willing to pay for low carbon steel? And I said, respectfully, I think we should rather be thinking about how can we show the true total cost of carbon in the steel such that it's easy for people to source the lower emitting carbon, because the true cost is reflected in the price. So I think that's something that we may want to think about, that would just make it easier for everybody, because you could just be sourcing the lower carbon steel that has proper emissions pricing factored into that pricing. I think for us on the mainland too, we're looking with interest at what we have a lot of properties on the mainland, as you know. We're quite interested in the fact that the central government's made its 2060 commitment. There's some indication that over the next few years that there may be movement on the suppliers of materials that will help things along. We think, I mean, the government's help will be critical for this.
Great, thank you, John. We have a question for Margaret. So with regards to governance, and I totally love that diagram on sort of the importance of governance, because all of the E and S basically would follow if you don't have any governance at the end of the day. So the question here is, since it is sort of the bigger, very most important foundation, what is the issue with governance? Is it that it's evaluated, typically linked with time, or because it's only looked after by certain stakeholders within a company, whether it's the board or maybe just a certain section of the company? What do you feel are the reasons why we are still in this siloed mode of E, S, and then G, as opposed to G being that foundation or umbrella?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an easy answer. Whether the governance, when we do the research or we look at governance structures and processes, whether that's a reflection of the way people are viewing the issues, or if it's in fact different structures or processes that are suggested that will bring the thinking together. We suspect that through most of the research, and it's quite nascent really, and that is what we're finding is that when we look at governance structures and processes, it reflects actually how people think about the E, the S, and the economy. And what we're seeing happening is that the ESG piece is still reflected in an add-on. So it's in a separate committee. Even if that committee is raised to sort of director or board level, it still appears somewhat separate. So is the language pushing our thinking that then the E and the S, the environment and social, needs to be still added on? Versus the very traditional thinking, of course, and the key driver, it is the core pillar, and that is shareholder interests and financial profit maximization. So if that remains the core, then everything else will sort of sit on the periphery. And then it's reflected in those structures. Now, that's not to say there's one ideal structure. I believe that both the research and obviously companies will say that we have to set it up according to our corporate culture, the nature of the industry, your context in which you operate. And that fair enough, absolutely. However, what we're finding, even when we do evaluations and assessments as a class exercise, students are finding the same thing. We see that the structure of the board committees is reflecting that the environment and social issues people are still struggling to integrate that into the financial operation as well, because we see it as a separate committee. So taking sustainability issues, environmental, social accountability, and integrating it into the existing board structure could be one way of approaching it. And therefore we have to increase fluency and understanding across the board. I personally think that that's the way to go. We have to integrate it. So we have to go way beyond whether boards of directors understand climate change. We have to have the directors and all the committee members understanding environmental, social issues as an integrative whole. And if I can be indulged just for one more minute, and something that both Jamie and John alluded to, and I'd like to build on it, and that is this materiality process. I actually think there's a great opportunity with this process, and it's not being well used at all. It's become a bit more of a tick box exercise. Let's talk to a few people, let's get through the process, raise a few issues. And so the risk actually is, ironically, it's the missed opportunities of using materiality as part of a strategic tool. And I think if materiality was actually brought up to the board level, I actually think that might be a tool that would help increase this fluency of the C, society, environment, and economy being more integrated.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret. And in fact, now that you're on the point of opportunities, which I think, we want to move forward from a lot of the challenges. In fact, we did have a more specific question asking John about sort of the opportunity side and the challenges of looking at opportunities, but also how you're seeing it. But I also wanted to open up, to Jamie and Margaret on this topic of opportunities. How can companies move forward from just looking at risk to start to integrate the opportunity, business development, business strategy side? That seems to be sort of the next stage where we're experiencing maybe a little bit of a hiccup or hurdle at this point in time. But John, maybe you can share your perspectives from the Hang Lung side on opportunities for you all.
Sure, and I think the opportunity side will be specific to each business. So what may be an opportunity for us may not directly translate to others, but I can elaborate a little from our perspective. I mean, we're in the business of real estate, obviously, so it matters, the kind of customer experience our tenants have, and people walking in as their customers into our mall. So first of all, the resilience of our properties and being able to offer some assurance around that resilience we see as one form of opportunity. But I think more fundamentally too, if you look at major international companies that are tenants in our properties and elsewhere, they are increasingly making sustainability commitments of their own. And we see an opportunity to strengthen our relationships with them by conveying to them that we're taking this issue seriously, we're engaging with it, we're working on the performance of our buildings, existing and future buildings, so that we would like increasingly for them to have that as another reason why they want to be in our properties. So they're in our properties because we have good locations and because we can offer good customer relationship management in some aspects, and we can help them with obviously revenue generation. But you can see that the Amazons of the world are increasingly paying attention to their entire value chain, and for them that means thinking about what kinds of buildings are they in. And so I just give Amazon as an example, not related directly to our business, but so for us, it's about aligning with our customers for the long term and being able to offer them a sense that we can be their partner on this, because they're disclosing on this as well, and they want to satisfy this aspect of their supply chain.
Thank you. Jamie?
I would say firstly, as John's slide showed, it's not just about the new products and services you might offer, it's also about your internal processes, your efficiencies and cost savings and so on. And as Margaret's slide very eloquently showed, it's thinking strategically about governance and about ESG. I might just add one other thought, and that's that one of our concerns over 20 years of covering CG in Asia is that many companies look at corporate governance very much as a compliance exercise, and they are still not gaining the real value of corporate governance. I could talk about this for hours, but there's so much value in it.
Days and weeks.
And I think the same is happening in ESG, that companies are looking at, oh, I've got to produce an ESG report. Oh, it's a compliance, not yet another compliance thing. Oh, the investors are asking me for yet another set of standards, TCFD, SASB. This is never ending. That's really the wrong way to look at this. It's about sitting down with your boards, thinking strategically about, how this really impacts your business and how your business will change. And in that process, working out, what are the specific new opportunities for you as a business. So, but it's really up to the companies and the directors to sort of think this through.
Right, Margaret?
I really think that we have to step up that curve and out of sort of the reactive ESG mindset. And I do say I feel for companies, because many of these systems are actually sort of keeping companies in some respect in a compliance mindset. It's everything's about risk, right? And of course, as long as we keep this sort of legal regulatory approach to things, I feel that companies may be held back. One of the opportunities, I really feel it goes back to what's often been referred to as the softer side of governance, and that's stakeholder engagement. And, it's a big term, but I actually think engaging stakeholders is actually even less scarier than TCFD. By identifying really key stakeholders out there in the community that you can work with, reach out, collaborate, build those alliances. And that speaks to one of the major World Economic Forum's 2020 global risk headlines, and that was the fraying of these multilateral systems and alliances, which we've taken for granted. And as that's happening around us, I think more than ever, corporations can actually help rebuild these alliances, these multilateral systems, by reaching out and working with others in the community, and particularly looking upstream rather than downstream all the time. And because looking downstream is, again, reactive, it's after the problem's been sort of created. Whereas if we look upstream, we start looking at our upstream supply chain. If we start looking at things like ecosystem services dependencies, things like the risks that businesses are facing as a result of their dependence on ecosystems, environment, natural resources, there is a myriad of opportunities when you go upstream and start looking at these. And at the risk of being, saying brands on a TV, there's tons of projects that can be used as examples of how businesses in different industry sectors have really created opportunities with other organizations by looking upstream and engaging stakeholders. I think there's great opportunities to change that viewpoint.
Great, thank you so much, Margaret. So due to time, I'm going to do one last question, although it will merge the last two questions that we've received. So, basically moving forward, the big question is, how can corporate leaders begin to really tackle this problem of climate corporate governance? How do you strengthen climate corporate governance within organizations? What should leaders do? And just a little bit of a throwback to, BEC's report, they had mentioned there were 3 hurdles that they had brought up. First, lack of data or accurate data. Second, lack of the right expertise or the depth of expertise. And then third, lack of awareness of climate resilience itself, which, brings back Margaret's point about, what are the impacts back on the business in terms of what climate change could do. And so, it'd be great if I can sort of throw this question back to all three of you. And John, in particular, one of the questions was, also, what do you feel about your ESG data reporting? Do you think you can improve on it? That I think goes to one of, or actually two of the points that BEC had mentioned in the report. So maybe John, you want to go first?
Sure. So I would say that the most fundamental thing that's needed to set the stage for climate governance is on the awareness side and the understanding. What's really critical and what's been helpful for me in my role is that our senior management and board have understood the enormity of this issue. And so that's the first hurdle. Do you understand that climate change is this transformative issue where we need to move very quickly in the next decade if we're going to try to address this crisis? And that's a kind of a binary question. Does your board get that or not? Because if it gets that, if it starts to get that, that doesn't mean that everything is easy all of a sudden. It doesn't mean there won't be dilemmas, but at least now you've framed the right context for what is going to be quite a transformative journey. I think with respect to data and reporting, there's a lot that we could probably do to keep improving. One of the things we had to decide is which indices and benchmarks do we focus on first. I think what's been helpful is that the framework that I introduced as an earlier slide, we now sort of frame our sustainability report around those major issues. So I think there's a kind of a coherence to the narrative that people will see continuing over several years, where we can update people. What are we doing on climate resilience? How are we doing on well-being? People will understand the same issues each year and the annual KPIs that are tied to performance around those major issues. So we're not always just reacting to a different framework, but fundamentally we have a sense of our own materiality and priorities and are creating a narrative around that where people will be able to see and consistently track our progress against over time.
Right, Jamie.
Yes, I think awareness clearly is critical. Awareness of the board leadership, awareness of the controlling shareholder, because if they don't buy into this, the company isn't going to change. And there's a lot of information out there companies have access to, and there's a lot of stakeholders they can talk to. So, I mean, perhaps one simple way is talk to your stakeholders, talk to your shareholders, ask them, are they comfortable with your level of climate board governance or, approach to climate risk? But I think also for the vast majority of companies, if there's clear government policy around, for example, net zero climate change, then that is actually a major spur to companies. I think, again, the better, more effective companies, many of the blue chips will do this anyway. But I think what we've seen around the region is it's when you get a clear government commitment, we see this particularly in North Asia, then companies start really moving.
Excellent, thank you. Margaret.
Data, yes, I do empathize for companies. There's way too much data out there. What I suppose one way of tackling it is looking at your own context of your business first. What is it that you want to achieve? Look at the reporting frameworks in terms of what is the purpose of the framework first, and see if in fact it actually satisfies what it is you've identified you need to do. So I actually think going back to that materiality process is very, very useful. And then it helps you identify where you need to focus and then go look for the data that you need, as opposed to, I think what tends to happen is there's this menu of indicators. We go, oh, we've got to go and get the data. Oh, this is the data that's on hand. This is the data we understand, so therefore we'll just report it. And sometimes that's more confusing, and it's also a waste of time and resources. So I wonder if even the approach that an organization takes to the data they need to be more strategic, and that needs to be decided ahead of time. What's the question you're asking? What's the problem that you're trying to address? And then go from that end, rather than sort of go, okay, here we have this whole list of indicators against which we need to report. And I think that might help companies take a bit more of a focused, not a waste of time approach. But I do empathize, because it is hard. Companies have to find their context and what direction they're going in. And every industry sector is different, right? And their context they operate in. So it's, I think I'd go back to the materiality process if you're at the beginning of this journey and use that wisely. There are people that can help organizations to be more strategic and sort of move away from this sort of a bit too ESG-ish focused, which I think is a bit too data indicator driven.
Excellent. Thank you, Margaret. And so I think due to time, I think I will hand over, but thank you so much for all of our guest speakers today for sharing their insights. I'm sure there's plenty more if we had more time, but thank you so much. And over to
Thank you, Jeannie, and our panelists. This also concludes the webinar. An event feedback questionnaire will be sent to you shortly. Please take a few moments to fill in the form. If you're interested to know more about future VEC events, please follow our social media channels. Thank you again for joining us this morning, and have a nice day.